Most people think of keto as a weight loss trend, maybe something they tried for a few weeks and then gave up on. But what if I told you that it's been used as a medical intervention for over 200 years and the science behind it goes way deeper than just trying to fit into your genes? In this podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Koutnik, a metabolic researcher and a performance physiologist whose work spans nutrition, exercise, cognition, and metabolic disease. Andrew trained at the University of South Florida under Dominic D'Agostino, one of the biggest names in ketogenic research. And he's worked with Special Operations Command, the Department of Defense, and NASA on human performance in extreme environments. You might have also seen him on some big podcasts like Diary of a CEO, where he breaks down a lot of this science for a massive audience. But here's what makes Andrew different than most researchers. He lives with type 1 diabetes himself. He's not just studying this stuff in a lab, he's been running these experiments on his own body for over a decade. In this conversation, we get into what ketosis actually does at a metabolic level, why insulin is the master switch at controlling whether you burn sugar or fat, and how keto applies differently in type 1 versus type 2 diabetics, including the safety side when people make that switch at first. We also tackle performance. There's surprising data showing that once you're properly adapted, there's no meaningful drop in sprint or endurance output, which challenges everything most of us were taught about needing carbs to perform. And we get into something that most people miss entirely, the fit but unhealthy athlete, and why even elite endurance athletes can show signs of prediabetes. Then we break down the supplement side, including MCTs, ketone salts, and ketone esters, and what's actually useful, what's hype, and when ketones might legitimately be a cognitive tool. This one goes deep, but it stays practical. Let's get into it. All right, and we're live. Andrew, thank you for joining us, man.
Hey, it's an absolute honor and glad to be here and be here talking with you. You're an absolute superstar. So it's kind of an honor to get to chat with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. You are an expert in your field, so I'm always interested to chat with people that know considerably more about about anything than I do, especially this topic. So I do just want to go ahead and get started. I want you to tell your story. I did a little bit of an intro beforehand, but you're somebody that has type 1 diabetes, and that's kind of became your path towards whatever you're passionate about in your research. And it's deeply tied to type 1 diabetes and diabetes in general and ketogenic diet and all of those fun things that I'm really interested in and don't know too much about. So I just wanted to ask you kind of how that all started. How did your personal experience and your academic path pull you into the keto world, both as a researcher and as a practical tool of using it every day?
So I started as a kid with obesity. So that's really where a lot of this began for me, because when I had obesity as a young kid in middle school and early high school, it frames a lot of the way you view yourself. You're overweight, you don't feel as self-confident. It affects where you are with your peers and other things like, oh yeah, it shouldn't, but it absolutely does. And so all I wanted to do was be bigger, stronger, faster. And my family was a bunch of people who exercised. My dad had run marathons. My uncle had run over 20 marathons, done multiple century rides. My dad did a few century rides. Like, they were very active people. And I was active as well. Played sports, did a lot of the things, but I still was gaining weight at a very fast rate. Eventually became obese, and because of that, I started to think, well, how do I overcome this? And so I started using, which is the most obvious things for most people, which is diet and exercise. But I kept failing. And it wasn't any particular tool other than accountability and a plan that actually allowed me to be successful. And a lot of that was just focused on healthier forms of food and having a set schedule and consistency. And I got some success with that. But that was more of my passion into this field. What turned it into a career, a scientific career, that was a year later when I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which is a disease where your body no longer produces the most powerful hormone in all metabolism. And as a result, you lose control over glucose. You have no insulin production, so you now have to inject this molecule, and it has a huge impact on your daily existence. But you quickly realize how powerful things like nutrition, things like exercise, sleep, medications, sunlight, all these different factors, and the list can go over 40. I could bore your audience to death with this, but you see all of their micro effects on glucose, insulin, the two most powerful hormones in all metabolism. And I spent the rest of my life obsessing about how to get the best control, because I was realizing, Clay, that meant that if I had control over it, I was thinking better, I was feeling better, and I was performing better. And everything aligned with what I was learning throughout my PhD at University of South Florida College of Medicine, where you're also from.
Shout out.
I trained there under Dominic D'Agostino. a kind of a legend in the ketogenic diet space, ketone biology, where I actually went on to study the advanced administration of these various ketogenic tools. We could talk more about that in various disease and performance settings. I then transitioned after my work with Dom to Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, where we worked with Special Operations Command, Department of Defense, NASA, and a few other entities, trying to apply these various tools at the highest level of cognition, the highest level of performance with the greatest stakes on the line. After that, I went to transition to work because of my passion and personal lived experience with type 1 diabetes, had kind of a namesake in the type 1 diabetes world called Sansum Diabetes Research Institute, where I was in charge of leading research projects revolving nutrition and chronic diseases like obesity, prediabetes, diabetes, type 1 diabetes, and also what was known as fatty liver disease, also now known as metabolic associated steatotic liver disease. Then ultimately transitioned back home to Florida State University to bridge all of it together, all of my passions into one at the Institute for Sports Science and Medicine, where we take the highest level of performers, the people living with chronic disease, and utilize lifestyle strategies in order to understand how their metabolism works and ultimately working to maximize their health and performance.
Right. So to back up a little bit, you mentioned a bunch of different areas that you focused on early on, including diet, exercise, sleep, sunlight, medications, whatever it may be. And as unfortunate as it is, like me going through medical school, we only probably learned about one of those, which was the medication side of things. And we don't get a lot of training, if any training, about the diet and exercise portion in particular. And it's funny, I was in medical school and a friend had come up to me and said, hey, there's this guy who is thriving, or at least doing really well, solely eating meat. And so, not saying that that's anywhere close to the same thing as the ketogenic diet, which we'll get into, but I went on my own little journey and tried a carnivore diet for a few months. And it's not something that I recommend everybody do. And I realized that it was just kind of a great elimination diet. But a lot of things got better. Like my dandruff went away. My mood was more stable. I didn't have to drink caffeine anymore. I was more rested on less sleep. I couldn't sunburn as easy, which was very strange. Like so many different things fell into play and I started feeling much better. And so the role of a ketogenic diet, now after I've, had 5 or 6 years since then, and I've started to realize how much of a role diet comes into play, and it can be used as a medication in a sense. It's really interesting to me, kind of the rise and fall and now rise again that the ketogenic diet has had. I feel like around 2012, 2015, 2018, keto everything was kind of the trendy move. And then we stopped hearing about it maybe a little bit for a couple of years, or at least it wasn't as booming. And now within the past 6 months, I feel like there has been so much more hype around it. Now that we're starting to get real research, now that at least that research is starting to surface in a meaningful way and people are starting to hear about it, now that we're getting all of these different types of ketogenic supplements that you can use now. So I'd really love just to dive in there real quick, especially for the listeners, on what exactly is the ketogenic diet and how, from a metabolic level, how does that change compared to somebody that's just eating a standard American diet?
That's a great question. I'll actually ask you a question to introduce this because I think this is the best way for people to try to understand it, which is, when did you first hear about a ketogenic or carnivore style diet, Clay?
I would say ketogenic diet was probably in probably 2017-ish, if I had to guess. And it was more so thought of as this insanely prohibiting, extremely hard, restrictive diet. That's kind of what I thought about it. And then the carnivore side, I probably heard that. I think I heard that in 2022. And that was after COVID, when I started questioning a lot of different things of the medical establishment. So I was, that kind of changed my narrative on what to think about diet and exercise.
Got it. Okay, so 8 years ago. Now, I asked that question because I think the best way to tell how the ketogenic diet works is to actually go back in history. So the ketogenic diet's first report on the ability to be utilized as a medicinal tool, so a approach of using a lifestyle strategy, the diet, so a choice of what you buy in the grocery store, this versus that, has been utilized to prevent and reverse diabetes since 1796. It has been utilized to reverse obesity since 1860s. It has been utilized to reduce neurological or not symptoms, but things like seizures in epilepsy since 1921. It has been utilized for a variety of chronic metabolic conditions since then. This is actually not a new trendy topic. It has been around as one of the most evidence-based dietary strategies for the therapeutic use for not just the prevention of disease, but the management and sometimes reversal of many of the chronic diseases plaguing America and the Western world today. What it is, in the most simplest of terms, is a diet that dramatically reduces the sugary, starchy forms of carbohydrates in the diet. So if someone were to walk into the grocery store and they say, well, what should I buy? Typically, the foods in the center of the grocery store are the ones that are packaged, high carbohydrates, low fiber, low food quality, low food density. Those are the foods you typically want to avoid. You want to prioritize foods that are protein and also fat-based. Okay, so what does that look like when someone actually eats a diet like this? It may look like they first pick a protein, which might be something like eggs, salmon. It could be some form of cheese, nuts. Ultimately, they're choosing a primary protein source. Then they'll probably have some green leafy vegetables, but the type of vegetables in this diet are the type that are the highest fiber content form of vegetables, because you want the net carbohydrates and the glucose impact to be very low. That's spinach, broccoli, asparagus, bok choy, cabbage, cauliflower, and smaller portions, maybe things like Brussels sprouts, things like some forms of squash, etc. That means that the glucose and insulin impact is going to be much lower. Then the rest of the food, the rest of the calories of that plate is typically coming from things like fat. Let's say you had a salad of some form of spinach or mixed greens, and you have olive oil on that. Or let's say that the protein source you chose was salmon, and so it's already coming with a lot of healthy fats, or beef, which already comes with a lot of fat. And then you might add things like nuts or some other form of healthy fat to that diet. So when you look at, you go to the grocery store and you pick up a health magazine and it has a picture of a salad with little garnishes like nuts and then a salmon with a lemon on top. That is a plate for a ketogenic diet meal. And so it's completely compatible with what we know as health foods, but it's about choosing the right type of strategy. So again, low carbohydrate, prioritizing protein, the type of carbohydrates you consume are very high fiber, typically those green leafy vegetables. And then you're adding healthy forms of fat, or sometimes the fats already come along with a protein source you chose. That's really a ketogenic diet. But backing up a little bit to also explain some of the things you mentioned, okay, you started seeing changes in dandruff and a bunch of other physiologic changes in how you felt, how you responded to sunlight, all these things. Well, a lot of times this diet is helping people remove many of the terrible, I won't call it toxic because I think that word's a little bit hard to define when we think about food, but it is removing many of the challenging foods in our food environment that challenges our health, that exposes us to ingredients that we don't actually know the health consequences to. And by just simply removing so many of those unknown factors, those packaged foods, those low nutrient dense foods, we're now prioritizing whole foods, healthy foods, real foods, and all of a sudden people feel better. That shouldn't be a shock to anyone, right? If you were to just focus on those fundamental principles, you typically would get better in the general sense. But what's unique about this diet, Clay, is that when you reduce carbohydrates sufficiently, it also means your body reduces this powerful hormone called insulin. Insulin is the most powerful hormone in all of metabolism. It controls whether your body stores fat, puts in glucose into various tissues like your liver and your muscle as muscle glycogen. It controls many of the key metabolic hormones in the body that regulates if you are going to burn fat, convert and produce things like ketone bodies. It also controls many other hormones like glucagon and whether glucagon will be elevated or lowered. Suffice it to say, it is the master regulator of metabolism, and it works primarily and is released primarily when glucose is elevated. Well, what's the primary way of elevating glucose in the body? Eating carbohydrates. And so if you reduce the amount of glucose from those carbohydrate sources, so reducing those packages, refined carbohydrates, very high glucose forms of carbohydrates, even some forms of fruits like bananas, oranges that have rapid glucose impacts, that helps lower the insulin level in the body. And within the first meal, you see the impact on glucose and the impact on insulin. Over the next 7 days to 21 days to 4+ weeks, there's these multiple phases that happen. But overall, what is happening is your body is switching from this reliance on sugar as a fuel, almost near complete reliance on sugar as a fuel, and subtly starting to shift at the first meal towards utilizing your fat that you have stored usually over years and years to allow you to last for months and months without any food, to utilize that as your new primary form of fuel. And along with that fuel source being your new primary form of fuel, your body converts some of those fats into these molecules called ketone bodies, which go to the brain, provide brain fuel, but also have these powerful antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, something called epigenetic, where it actually goes to your genes and actually changes the way your genes work. And so a lot of these powerful shifts occur simply by choosing the right foods and reducing the amount of high glucose, high insulin forms of carbohydrates in the diet. And it causes this massive, arguably the most powerful shift that any diet can do on your metabolism.
Today's episode is supported by my friends over at Purist Nutrition. If you're looking to simplify your nutrition without losing performance, you need to go check out their grass-fed whey isolate and their creatine plus. What sets Purist apart is the no-fluff approach. They use clean, minimal ingredients, and most importantly, they are NSF certified for sport. It's the highest standard of quality that you can expect from any supplement company. Head over to puristnutrition.com and grab your stack. Feel free to use the code MOSS at checkout. Walk me through how a ketogenic diet would work differently for type 1 versus type 2 diabetes. And then also a personal question that I have, because I have friends and family members who have both of those conditions. Is there an initial risk window when somebody first starts or gets into a ketogenic diet, especially for type 1 diabetics that are titrating insulin levels?
Great question. I think I should introduce this term called contraindications. So in the field of medicine, there are this term where you describe what are the all-out medical concerns that you shouldn't administer, like they call it absolute contraindications, things you should never do this diet if you have. And those main ones are things like errors of fat metabolism, usually genetic inborn errors of metabolism. These are incredibly rare and not common. There used to be things called relative contraindications, and type 1 diabetes used to be one of them. Well, I'm a patient living with type 1 diabetes who's done this diet for well over a decade and actually published my own data on my own effects of administering this diet longitudinally for over a decade. When you ask these questions about its application to two forms of diabetes, let's first define them. So type 2 diabetes is a form of diabetes where it's called insulin resistance, or that's how it's best known. You have high glucose levels, you have very high levels of insulin. The insulin's not working like it should because you develop metabolic damage over time. Usually obesity is the primary risk factor. And as a result, the insulin your body produces is resistant. And then you have this form of type 1 diabetes, which is insulin deficiency, where you don't produce any insulin and now you have to inject your body with that insulin exogenously in order to make up that deficiency. Now, what's interesting about both forms of these diseases, they both have insulin resistance for completely different reasons. Type 2 diabetes has insulin resistance because typically the excess adipose tissue and energy toxicity that causes insulin to be less potent due to inflammation as one of the key drivers at the receptor where insulin binds. In type 1 diabetes, this is insulin deficiency. When you inject the insulin to make up that deficiency, it goes to the peripheral tissues, peripheral blood vessels. Well, just by the insulin being what they call hypersaturated in the peripheral tissues, called hyperinsulinemia in this peripheral tissue, that actually causes insulin resistance just by the route of administration. So as a result, type 1 and type 2 both typically have high and variable glucose levels and both have insulin resistance. But one's due to the insulin deficiency and how you have to medically overcome that deficiency in type 1, whereas type 2 is just an overabundance of bad lifestyle choices and habits and genetic underlying risk factors that causes insulin resistance. Now, that's the key difference between type 1 and type 2. But the ketogenic diet has been used medicinally for both of these for around 200 years. So in type 1 diabetes, the ketogenic diet was used to extend the life of patients prior to the discovery of insulin. They were finding that when patients got this disease, that when they just ate more carbohydrates, they would rapidly go into this state of called diabetic ketoacidosis. Their body was loading up with toxic levels of glucose and acid loads that was basically killing them in rapid order, oftentimes within days to weeks. Now, but when they reduced the amount of carbohydrates in the diet, the patients were relying on fat and protein as a fuel source, and they had very little insulin as it was deteriorating over time to almost zero, but they were able to survive for longer because they removed the quote unquote toxic component of the diet that was causing them to have these negative effects on acid load and glucose. Now, today, we have done the largest analysis ever in type 1 diabetes, looking at the impact of various carbohydrate amounts on outcomes. And I can say that today, based on that evidence, which will hopefully be published soon, that the very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet is the most evidence-based and physiologic sound diet to manage glucose and insulin levels in the normal range for people with type 1 diabetes. And that's incredibly important to appreciate because you're not going to find any major medical institute promoting this, which is unfortunate because it's the most powerful way to change it with lifestyle. It doesn't cost you any money. In fact, it often saves people hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in the healthcare system, usually tens of thousands of dollars per year when patients effectively implement this. That's type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes have utilized this diet to reduce the glucose and insulin load because they're both high in people with type 2 diabetes. And rapidly, they typically see reductions in weight. They start seeing rapid reductions in blood pressure for both water weight and fat loss. And they continue to progress in this journey. And that ultimately usually reduces the key risk factors that was causing the disease in the first place, the excess weight, which is usually the fat tissue, not muscle tissue, but the fat tissue, the excess energy toxicity in the form of glucose and others. And then ultimately, it's starting to address the inflammation and oxidative stress that was arising from those underlying factors. And so for both strategies, in fact, the American Diabetes Association has acknowledged since 2019 in their consistency report that the ketogenic diet or very low carbohydrate diet is the most evidence-based strategy for improving type 2 diabetes. And that must be appreciated because oftentimes you would think that if you just looked at what is on their website, you'd think that they would nothing to do with a very low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet strategy, when in reality, their experts have acknowledged its powerful therapeutic approach. But again, Clay, this is not new. This has been around for 200 years for the prevention, management, and in some cases reversal, in the case of type 2 diabetes, of diabetes. So, it's a very powerful medicinal strategy for both those diseases.
If you're somebody that has, let's say, a quote unquote normal physiology, you don't have type 1, you don't have type 2 diabetes. Granted, a lot of us are kind of walking around in this purgatory area of insulin resistance, but not quite type 2 diabetes. But let's just say somebody that has a stone cold normal hemoglobin A1C, they're not showing any signs of insulin resistance. What would be a reason for them to experiment with something like a ketogenic diet? What I'm saying basically is, what are the benefits of it aside from just avoiding or helping a diabetic, disease state?
So that's actually a very rare person nowadays, Clay, because we know that up to 90% of individuals in the United States, both based on multiple studies, one cited 88% at UNC and another one at Tufts University at 93%, show that virtually 9 out of 10 people in the United States of America have some form of early signs of metabolic dysfunction. Either their waistline is elevated, their triglycerides are elevated, their glucose is starting to elevate, or some other underlying metabolic biomarker is going in the wrong direction and it is noticeably out of optimal range. That's 9 out of 10 people in America. New studies have also illustrated that if we redefine obesity, not just as a weight to height ratio called body mass index, but actually look at the amount of adipose tissue, look at the organ and tissue damage that accompanies, and also symptoms that accompany obesity, 7 out of 10 adults in the United States of America have a definable form of obesity. So what you're saying is, what happens if you're the rare 10 to 30% of America who doesn't actually have one of these underlying issues that the ketogenic diet has been shown for 200 years to fix? For those people, it's a quality of life factor. So Clay, I can look at you. I've seen you on social media. You're a fit guy. You work out. For all intents and purposes, people would say, look, he's a fitness expert. They're going to look at you as a health and fitness expert because you look like you walk the talk and you know what you're talking about. So in that category, Clay, why would you even consider it? Well, you already described earlier, okay, I did this diet and all of a sudden I started to discover powerful things about how removing certain foods from my diet started to clear up a lot of issues. Maybe it was the removal of these other forms of food. Maybe it was the change in physiology that comes with these ketogenic style diets. It's one of these things. But here's the thing. You never know until you try. Oftentimes people live in a state of subtle metabolic perturbance and they have no idea. They have no idea what it would be like to maybe not have that issue until they maybe try a diet that has been shown to help improve multiple biomarkers of metabolism for many people and see what that effect is. Oftentimes in science, because Clay, I've published over 100 publications and/or abstracts and international presentations. And what we publish is often the average outcome of a study, showing that on the average, this is the expected outcome we expect in this type of people with this intervention. But the reality is that every single study, it's very rare to see a study where every single person responded the same way. Although it's more common in these diet studies to see improvements in glucose and insulin, almost universally we see that. But it's not always universal that the therapy affects everyone the same way. And so this is where it comes to individualization. No matter what the science says, that's telling you the general expected outcomes you would expect if you tried that intervention. However, what if you're the outlier? Now, for your audience, what does that mean? That means if you look at the average outcome for that intervention, or that, let's say in this case, a ketogenic diet, this is the average expected change in your blood pressure, your weight, or your glucose levels, or your insulin. But what if you're someone who would respond even more powerfully? What if you were the person that was way below the average or way above the average? You would never know that if you just accepted that this line that was the average outcome will be your outcome. The only way you will know that, Clay, is if you actually try yourself and see how you feel and you respond. But one word of caution, there is definitely a way to do this diet wrong. And that's usually by just Googling it outright and saying, what is this? Because you're usually going to come across the most hyperbolic articles. They got the most clicks, and it got the most clicks because usually it was a bout of controversial misinformation. You need to find trusted experts who know what they're doing, who understand the science and evidence on the strategy, and ideally have implemented it successfully on themselves or other people. Because no better example than when someone has actually done it and found success. Someone can look at a textbook all day and say, well, this is what I expect to see happen. And then you have these other people over here who actually did it. And quickly you learn, oh, well, there's a few tweaks here or there and these things that you should adjust because they actually had to apply it in the real world, which is often very different than in a controlled laboratory setting, which most publications describe. So again, that's what I would implore people to think about is you'll never know how you feel until you try this intervention, arguably the most powerful dietary intervention to change physiology that we know of. And beyond that, everyone's slightly different in their response to everything, but you'll never know until you try. So find the right resources, trusted resources, and also find people who actually done this and also maybe ideally helped people that, like, hey, as an example, if you have type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, I wouldn't go looking for the person with the, someone's going to hate that I say this, but this is just the truth. You don't go looking for the person with the worst glucose control and has never successfully done the diet to tell you what to do. You should go look for the person who's got the best glycemic control, who's successfully done this over time and overcome the challenges that every lifestyle change accompanies. And they're probably going to give you some good piece of advice along the way. And you maybe don't take all the advice, but take the ones that apply to you in your situation and go with it.
Yeah. And I think you touched on something really important too, that I've personally learned a lot from, and that's just experimenting on yourself and being hyper focused on differences in how your body reacts to certain things. Like when I was growing up and when I was in college, I never really paid attention to how I ate or how I felt. Like how I felt was just how I felt. It didn't have to do with what I was putting in my body. Like I just never put two and two together, which sounds so stupid at this point. But the more that I understand and the more that I will pay way more attention to, if I eat a high carb breakfast today, how is my focus, cognitive attention, word finding ability, brain fog, all of that come noon? How well am I able to focus? Like I was in the call room, when I was doing my medicine wards first year of residency, and the call doctor would come in and give everybody like a 24 pack of donuts, right? Like of course you eat the donuts and then you're just pissed off all day and wondering why you're having a terrible call. It's probably because you ate those donuts at 6 a.m. in the morning and your body's responding to it the entire day. So I urge anybody that hasn't really paid a lot of attention to what they put in their body and how their body adapts to it to go ahead and do that. Because even though I wasn't pursuing any sort of ketogenic diet, I started to realize like, hey, if I have a bowl of spaghetti for lunch today, I'm not going by 2 p.m. my brain is shot and I'm not going to be able to do anything. And that's just me. Some people respond differently. But going into ketosis, I'm curious about this because I feel like a lot of people get turned off by the thought of the quote unquote keto flu. And you've spoken about it before. And I think a lot of what I think about is in terms of performance and optimizing performance. And I was under the assumption that nobody could perform at a high level on a ketogenic diet, and that it was only restrictive in that purposes. And I've heard you speak about this before, so I'd love to get your opinion on, what that quote unquote keto flu is. How long does it take to actually get keto adapted? And then is somebody able to perform at the absolute highest level if they are on a ketogenic diet?
Keto flu is usually a symptom of things that are both totally predictable and preventable. So keto flu arises because your body's undergoing a very powerful metabolic change. That typically, when you reduce the amount of carbohydrates, the glucose load on your body reduces, the amount of insulin you're now secreting reduces. That insulin change that we talked about, that most powerful hormone metabolism, when it reduces, now you're not going to store as much water. You now not store as much sodium because for every gram of glucose that goes in the body, you now have 3 grams of water that goes in as well. So 1 gram of glucose goes with 3 grams of water, and that comes with sodium. So that's why when you eat carbohydrates, people are like, oh my gosh, I got so bloated. Like, yeah, you did. You put on a ton of water weight. Like, of course, you jacked up. And this is actually something that bodybuilders strategically do, is they will strategically eat a ton of carbohydrates to make their muscles look bigger by storing more water in them. And so oftentimes the first thing that happens is a pretty dramatic change in the amount of water retention. For the overwhelming majority of people, less water retention is probably a good thing. But when you start reducing the amount of water retention, you're starting to secrete and you're not holding as much sodium and you're not holding as much water. And so now you need to supplement that sodium until your body realizes this change in sodium retention and water retention is permanent. And that usually takes 2 to 4 weeks. And so this is actually a change in your kidneys, in your renal metabolism, because that's what actually reabsorbs sodium when it needs to. So what do? Okay, within the first, honestly, upon initiating the diet, you probably want to consume somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 milligrams, so 3 to 5 grams of sodium per day. And sometimes people need to supplement with 1 gram of salt here or there. So for the most part, that just means not restricting sodium when you undergo the ketogenic diet. There may be some exceptions to this of people who have blood pressure concerns, but the overwhelming amount of individuals, they're going to need to have sufficient amount of sodium and probably more than you were having before, unless you were already having too much sodium to begin with on this diet. Sodium loss and the inadequate levels of sodium during this transition until the body adapts is one of the most common reasons for feeling fatigued, for feeling irritable, for feeling a lack of concentration. And that's literally directly correctable by just taking in more sodium. So that's one of the biggest issues that occurs, but it's actually because of a positive metabolic change, at least for most people, which is the lack of sodium and water retention. Now, that's one of the first things that initially happens, and that's usually where the quote unquote keto flu comes from. Some people have to also supplement with things like potassium and magnesium. Potassium usually around up to 3,000 milligrams per day if needed. And a lot of that can come from the right type of green leafy vegetables or foods that you're consuming. Again, you can just use new AI tools. They're pretty good at telling you what to eat. And then magnesium, you can take this supplementally with like magnesium citrate, or these companies like, I don't get promoted by any of them, I don't get paid to say anything about this, but like Slow Mag or like Natural Calm. These are all options for people to supplement and overcomes the primary reason for most people on the keto flu. But understand that your body is going through a massive metabolic change. And that massive metabolic change means your body's going through an adaptation window that it's pushing to new fuel sources, away from sugar dominance towards utilizing your own fat tissue as its new form of energy. And it takes some time. Typically, most of the changes take about 4 weeks. And the reason we know this is because, to your point, Clay, we've done multiple studies in even athletes, high-level athletes, Ironman competitors who completed Ironmans, all the way to very high-level middle distance runners. And we've looked at, how long does it take for these athletes to go through this transition, metabolic transition, and reach back to their peak performance, okay, where they don't see a drop off in their performance anymore. And what we've reliably seen, not only in our studies, but also in almost virtually every historical study, that if you control all the key variables that impact performance. So a lot of these studies that look at sports performance, they probably don't control calories or the body weight change in the athlete or their activity load. Those are all key confounders that affect performance. Well, we've run multiple randomized controlled trials that controlled all of those to directly isolate out the what we call macronutrient or diet specific effect on performance. And what we found is that athletes, so we looked at middle-aged athletes who are fit, low body fat, the epitome of health, runners. It took them 4 weeks. And what they did is they did a high carb diet or a low carb diet. Then they were randomized after clearance of the diet for multiple weeks onto the other diet for 4 weeks. And we found that when they were on the ketogenic diet, they saw no decrease in 6 by 800 meter sprints, which is very high forms of intense aerobic exercise, or a max effort 1 mile time trial. So no, I don't mean like, oh, could they go run a mile? No, these people were running miles and miles. They were trying to run the fastest mile they could possibly run. And they were having the same mile performance and sprint performance, so max efforts on both of these typically more glucose dominant forms of exercise on the ketogenic diet, same performance. And so this completely challenged all the underlying assumptions that you need carbohydrates to perform. We were seeing that the body was able to shift powerfully over to fat predominant fuel. And we were seeing the highest levels of fat oxidation ever recorded at very high levels of exercise intensity. When exercise scientists and sports nutrition textbooks would have told you you needed carbohydrates to perform and fat wouldn't be able to be utilized. Well, this completely upends all of that. Now, a lot of the criticism of that initial study was that it was in short duration. And so we recruited Ironman competitors to see if that was in fact true and asked them to go for multiple hours at a very prolonged, strenuous form of aerobic exercise to see if doing the ketogenic diet had any negative impact on very long duration forms of exercise. And we saw yet again in Ironman competitors that there was no deterioration in performance, the same performance on ketogenic diets versus high carb diets in the same athletes while controlling all those key variables in very prolonged strenuous form of exercise. And in a hitting the wall session, so we asked them to go 70% of their maximal aerobic capacity and to go until they couldn't go anymore. And we were seeing athletes going well over 4 hours in duration. These are high level athletes. And so what we were seeing is that across the two extremes, this very sprint and very short form of very intense exercise, or very prolonged, even strenuous, but not as intense forms of exercise, that athletes saw no deterioration in their performance on the ketogenic diet. And this really fundamentally challenged this idea that you need carbs to perform. And what we were seeing is that they could perform exactly the same. But Clay, here's the kicker. And this is probably the most important thing anyone can take around what I'm saying here. Some of these athletes, we were discovering that when we put on continuous monitoring of their glucose levels, and of course did all the calibrations and controls to make sure this was accurate, they were having glucose levels in the fasted basal metabolic state consistent with prediabetes on the high carb diet. Even though they were normal body weight, they were fit, and they were exercising all the time. And this is 30% actually, not like 30% of them. And this is actually shown across multiple studies. So there's this phenomenon called the fit but unhealthy athlete. And one of the key drivers is diet. And we know that these high carbohydrate sports nutrition guideline strategies, which are not just promoted by ACSM, ISSN, dietitian communities, but also the Gatorade Sports Nutrition Institute, all these entities are contributing to these high forms of carbohydrate intake, appear to not only be not necessary, but potentially metabolically harmful. And that is probably the most important thing because athletes are largely believed to be immune to these metabolic consequences. But what we were seeing is they are not. And there is a primary example of this in the public space of a guy named Lionel Sanders. He was a world champion triathlete, fit, exercising for 3 to 4 plus hours every single day, was consuming over 1,000 grams of carbohydrate, which is what, by the way, completely consistent with the sports nutrition guidelines for his fitness and exercise output. And he developed prediabetes. And he had the medical records. He publicly came out about it. And what did he do? He did the most obvious thing on earth that we talked about here, reduce the amount of highly glycolytic, ultra-processed forms of carbohydrates in his diet, and nearly immediately resolved his prediabetes, which is the same thing we saw. We saw that in athletes who switched to a low-carbohydrate diet, the 30% who had prediabetes, every single one of them resolved their prediabetes almost immediately within days.
Wow.
And so it's important to appreciate that these athletes aren't immune to the same problems that the rest of society is, that our food environment is one of the most powerful drivers of the consequences we see on our metabolism, which is leading to these astronomical rates of obesity, diabetes, has arguable impact on things like mental and brain health disorders, because we've also known that these interventions can successfully assist in improving not only the symptoms, but in sometimes reversing these conditions, utilizing these same dietary strategies we're talking about.
When somebody is in that state where they are adapting to their body performing on a new fuel source, and they're doing the ketogenic diet and they're kind of in that first month, or let's say even after that, is this an all or nothing ordeal where if they're doing everything great for 2 weeks and they have one slice of pizza, are they starting over at hour number one? Or is it kind of an actual adaptive state where the more that you are on a low carb ketogenic diet, the better your body is to kind of go back to that state if you quote unquote have a cheat meal?
Both are true. So if you are initially on the diet and you start pounding back weekend cheat days, you're never going to get there. Okay. If you're like, oh, I'm going to do it for 5 days on, 2 days off, because the weekend's like
Right.
my time to do what I want. What you're basically saying is that I'm going to do everything I need to start the initiation of the diet for 5 days, and then I'm going to reverse it for 2 days.
Right.
And then I'm going to repeat that cycle until I never actually reach normal, any new normal. And so your body's constantly going on a roller coaster. Do not recommend that. What I recommend is a commitment to this strategy, to eating healthier, whole food-based strategies, lower carbohydrate for at least the first 4 weeks. Because as you progress on this, you will also find that you can have one or two of these meals in it. You're not going to get kicked out of ketosis. In fact, it might subtly reduce the amount of ketones produced in the body as a sign of your level of ketosis, but you're getting right back into it. And what we actually see is that in athletes who are doing these diets, we find that when we look at the amount of fuel they're taking in from carbohydrates versus fat, the athletes on the ketogenic diet are actually taking in a better even split, although predominantly fat, of carbs and fat. They're not becoming almost exclusively reliant on fat. They're actually utilizing both. One would argue that's a sign of metabolic flexibility, the ability to utilize both strategies, because these athletes who are consuming super high levels of carbohydrates are locked into a near glycolytic or glucose dominance. So over 85% of the fuel or metabolic use is coming from their muscle glycogen and their circulating glucose levels, whereas less than usually 50% is coming from fat when you load up carbohydrates. And there's been some really refined gold standard studies that have looked at this. And so when we think about individuals who are considering this dietary approach and the phases they'll go through, it's important for individuals to realize you want to commit to this, think about how to make it sustainable, but also realize that can be completely compatible with what you actually think is health, what other people think is healthy, but it's about thinking about it for a sustainable long term. So what does that mean if they wanted to have pizza? Let's say they wanted to have ketchup, barbecue sauce, or they wanted to have that donut that your superior gave you so that you would crash 2 hours later. Although they didn't know that, they probably gave it to you thinking I'm being a nice guy and helping Clay feel better right now, although you're going to perform terribly, then they probably would have put you on a forced fast protocol if they knew that. But in that setting, Clay, realize that you can remake all those foods and make them healthier. So for example, like one of the primary examples I think most people can realize or appreciate is ketchup. If you look at the back of a ketchup label, let's say you went to these fast food restaurants or you went and bought ketchup at a grocery store, it's going to have very high levels of high fructose corn syrup. Okay. Or if you get the healthy version, Clay, maybe it has real sugar in it, not high fructose corn syrup.
Right.
So it's much healthier now. All right. But it still has huge sugar load. You know what? You can make that same exact ketchup with the tomato paste, the right spices and ingredients. You just Google it. And then instead of adding sugar, you add one of the 3 natural forms of sweeteners that have no caloric impact: stevia, monk fruit, or allulose. Okay. One of those 3. And you can make it taste identical to ketchup. And guess how many calories it has? Basically none. Okay. Whereas the one you were going to consume is going to spike your glucose through the wall. It's going to cause a huge insulin spike. And you're going to, not saying you're going to feel terrible afterwards, but you're probably going to feel like shit afterwards for most people who are consuming that. And you could have had an alternative that is completely healthy, completely compatible with a better overall metabolic state and virtually calorie free. That's just one example, but you can make pizza, you can make donuts, you can make cakes, you can make cookies, you can make all these same foods way healthier.
Right.
And they
That makes
taste
sense.
almost identical. And now you can go wrong on this approach too. Like you don't want to consume like keto candy every single day,
Right.
but you can make those same foods and make it sustainable. And the only reason that people are consuming high carbohydrate based foods is because of a set precedence, right? It's what's in the grocery store. It's what we've been subsidizing from an agricultural perspective in the forms of corns and wheats and everything else. If we had subsidized almonds or other things along the way, then we would have a whole food system prioritizing other things. So keep in mind, this isn't an alternative strategy, Clay. This is a strategy that's been around for 200 years that we've shifted away from due to incentives and other kind of cultural barriers, not because it's inherently better to do so.
I'll switch to another trendy topic. You talk about cutting down from a high carbohydrate diet. I feel like a high protein diet has become very trendy in the health and wellness space right now. People trying to eat, 1 gram per pound of body weight in order to have performance goals or maximize muscle protein synthesis or whatever it may be. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is there a amino acid insulin response for somebody that's eating or taking, 50-gram protein shake every single morning, or somebody that's really taking in a lot of protein, maybe without prioritizing the fat? Like, can you stay in ketosis while doing that?
So there's a lot in there to unpack for the average person. What I would say is like the simple rule for most people is that protein is a very helpful strategy that is a typically better nutrient source as that you want to focus on in your diet for most people, because if you eat sufficient amounts, again, in lieu of other ingredients, not just adding it on top, but in lieu of other foods like fats and carbohydrates, typically you're going to have a better overall effect. So you're going to be protein has a powerful effect on reducing your hunger. It also helps support muscle recovery and growth, all those other factors, right? So in that way, it's a very powerful nutrient that's arguably superior in many ways. But of course, you need to have a little bit of each of these nutrients to some degree to get all your central amino acids, central fatty acids, and then some form of fiber is probably not a bad idea for overall health, although not necessary, but probably not bad. Ideally, probably more optimal for health, although someone's going to disagree with me for sure. Does that mean that a protein has an insulin impact? It does, actually. So protein increases glucose levels through a totally different mechanism than carbohydrates do, but they do increase glucose levels. But the impact on those glucose levels is around 2.3 times less. Okay. So for every gram, so let's say you had 50 grams of a potato. They actually studied this in 1983. Collier and O'Deal published a study where they looked at a clinical physiology study, and they asked people to add 50 grams of potato, 50 grams of chicken breast, and then have it with or without fat in the form of 50 grams of butter. Now, what they found is that if you had the 50 grams of potato and you switched it to 50 grams of a chicken breast from protein, what you found is that you had, again, only 40% of the insulin response, much lower glucose response, almost virtually none, and again, 2.5 times less insulin. Now, if you're looking at that and you think, okay, well, it's a better shift, so it's less glucose and insulin to go from a carbohydrate to a protein in the same calorie, at the same amount of calories, 200 calories in both those options. However, you still have some glucose effect and some insulin effect, which is why some people on the ketogenic diet, when they're focused on getting higher ketone levels, which isn't necessarily the goal for everyone on this diet, but if it was, they may blunt some of their ketone levels or ketogenesis. The reason is because if you have more glucose load, more insulin load, the higher the insulin load, proportionally less fat oxidation and less ketone production. That's the name of the game. It's a dose-dependent response. And so that's why a lot of people on the carnivore diet actually don't necessarily produce a ton of ketone levels, because that's a super high protein diet. And for some people, if they're trying to manage their weight, if they're trying to prioritize managing glucose levels, it probably will do an overwhelmingly good job at doing that based on all of the physiology we understand about making that dietary shift. However, one could ask, is that optimal? And that's a very different question, and it's based on the individuals and their goals and maybe the underlying metabolic status. But in general, a quick answer I could have said to that question is yes, it does matter. It does have an impact, and you can consume too much of it. But for most people, they're probably trying to lose weight and feel better. And if they prioritize protein instead of these other nutrients, they're probably going to be much better off. In fact, the new dietary guidelines for 2026 and 2030 has focused on a 50 to 100% increase in that nutrient alone, because the overwhelming evidence says that when people prioritize protein, they typically do better overall on shifting things like hunger. It's obviously very important for muscle mass. In fact, I work with a world expert on protein feeding at night, and that seems to show the potential to help with body compositioning, increasing energy expenditure without any negative impact on sleep. So again, it seems like the greatest nutrient of all time. It's very trendy right now. But again, Clay, this has been around for decades. We've known that protein does all the things that we know it does right now for decades. It's just trendy in the health space now. But again, that come and goes with time. But again, yes, it can impact ketone levels through glucose and insulin responses. It's much less than carbohydrates. But at the end of the day, it's really up to the individual's goals and what their priority is. If you're trying to be a bodybuilder, okay, you probably need to have higher protein levels and not worry about those other factors. But if you're someone if you're someone with brain or mental health disorders and ketone levels has a direct impact on it, then yes, you probably want to keep protein at a diligent, precise level so you don't compromise your ketone production, which may have a therapeutic effect on you.
Got it. Makes total sense to me. As far as natural versus artificial ketosis, or let's say as far as a fast track into ketosis, is utilizing something like an extended fast and then going into a ketogenic diet, or using keto supplements into a keto diet to start off that diet? Are those two things able to be utilized in that scenario? Or if you do an extended fast and try to start keto, you're just starting at day one like you normally would? Does that make sense?
Fasting, it does. Fasting dramatically expedites your ability to get into ketosis because you're putting your insulin levels much lower, much faster. It is the fastest way to get into ketosis, without a doubt. You'll produce higher levels of ketone bodies at much quicker levels. You're depleting your glucose levels, and it's the fastest way to do it. And yes, people do actually use a fast sometimes in some situations to transition to a ketogenic diet because it's really forcing that adaptation quicker. But also understand that when you fast, it's not going to be quite as easy, right? You have no calories. That's what a fast is. It's not like, okay, some calories. No calories. And as a result, you're going to force an even faster, more robust adaptation. But when we talked about some of those keto flu symptoms, okay, well, then you might encounter some of that, including a dramatic increase in hunger until your body starts to normalize and elevate ketone production to a sufficient level. Yes, fasting does help with that. Now, when you ask about exogenous ketone bodies, can that help? Well, there are certain scenarios where exogenous ketones can be applied. We actually did a lot of research with this. So me and Clay both actually worked in the research world and actually looked at kind of military performance in a research setting. And one of the projects that I was focused on for a large period of time was a large special operations command project on the use of exogenous ketones for the military community in sports performance. And we were very focused on how it affects cognitive performance. And so we used a molecule. The project was actually originally funded to HVMN, which is now known as Ketone IQ. And what they were utilizing was this molecule that had two parts. One that is called 1,3-butanediol that converts to ketone bodies when it's consumed. So ketone bodies elevate through liver conversion. And then also had a component of just pure ketone as well. And so what that did is we found that in unique settings, like when people are exposed to stressors like high altitude and low oxygen environments, that it helped improve their resilience against that. So it increased not only their cognition, but it did so apparently through increasing also their oxygen uptake, which is fascinating because that's not something we expected to see in those projects. But it did lead to, in very controlled settings, even up to 20,000 foot altitude. So not quite Everest, but pretty damn close. And we found that putting them there pretty rapidly provided a pretty robust level of resilience against that. And an improved cognitive efficiency, reaction time, various metrics that would be important to have, particularly not only for the average person, but also for those individuals who their cognitive performance has a life or death consequence. And so we were seeing that, but that's actually one of the most common effects of these exogenous ketones is not necessarily for the transition, although it may help. But keep in mind, when you're trying to transition, you want to get insulin low. These exogenous ketone bodies have a powerful potential assistance tool for elevating ketone bodies. But what we have largely seen them being able to do is be utilized as a supplemental tool, both on high carb and ketogenic diets, where a lot of the research has started to see its powerful effect on its ability to improve cognitive and brain performance, even in sometimes healthy individuals. Like we've run a study where we did exogenous ketone administration And we found that in athletes who were about to engage in exercise, that exogenous ketone administration, even at not very high dosages, improved cognition in these young, healthy individuals, college age. And then they engage in exercise. And the athletes who didn't have exogenous ketones improved their cognitive measures equivalent to what the exogenous ketones did only after exercise. Now, your audience may be wondering, like, what does that mean? Well, it means that the individuals who were taking exogenous ketone bodies had an improvement in cognition that matched what exercise was doing in that study. Okay. So that's quite an impressive effect. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to do it for everyone all the time, but these are some of the effects that we have seen in some of our studies. And it really is fascinating because just the application of exogenous ketones alone lowers blood glucose levels. It dramatically changes the whole landscape of your metabolism, just the application of ketone bodies alone. We talked about earlier how it can change your genetic expression, increases antioxidant effects, so it lowers oxidative stress. It also blocks key inflammatory molecules like the NLRP3 inflammasome, and it has a number of all their effects, but there's also 3 forms of ketone bodies. And all of these molecules seem to have some degree of overlap in their metabolic and signaling effects, but also some distinct effects, like one of the ketone bodies called acetoacetate can directly stimulate lipolysis, so the breakdown of fat in the fat tissue, whereas the other molecules actually don't do that. They block that. So it's a very it's a lot of nuance in this, but suffice it to say that if someone were to consider something like exogenous ketone bodies, usually the best place to apply them is prior to some event or performance bout where they're actually attempting to improve things like a cognitive performance effect. But there have been some other effects long-term, Clay, like changes in EPO levels, recovery, and also capillarization or vascularization of muscle tissue over multiple week use. So there seems to be some chronic adaptations with having elevated ketone bodies through this supplemental use that can be really important over the long haul for performance.
Well, I want to ask you too, just in terms of keto supplementation, the way that I think about it, and correct me if I'm wrong, are just kind of your standard fats, your ketone salts, and then your ketone esters. If you're thinking about daily supplementation for general use, or one time every now and then, it's about to be a stressful scenario where you're competing or you're about to do a podcast where you have to be mentally sharp or go on stage, which ones of these are you using in different scenarios?
All right, so this is where we get into the nitty gritty of different types. Okay, so ketone salts, direct elevation of ketones in the blood, but they also come with a mineral load. Okay, so sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium to some degree. So someone who has hypertension or other issues like that, they probably don't want to consume a lot of sodium. And there's also a GI tolerance issue. So you can only get so much of those minerals in before you have issues. And they've seen that in performance-based bouts. So that's the limitation of those, but it directly elevates ketone bodies, and those molecules are becoming more powerful than they used to be. Now, that's one option, okay, and that's usually in the form of the physiologically or R or D beta-hydroxybutyrate. But there's also something called L or S-PHP, which is what we used to think is non-physiologic form of beta-hydroxybutyrate. But yet we know that there are people who produce L and or SBHB, however you want to term it, normally, endogenously. This is something that is actually produced. It is not a non-metabolic ketone body. It is actually produced by people at subtle levels and at much higher levels in some individuals to degrees we don't totally understand, but it is actually present. That one elevates and lingers for longer. Now, it's less metabolically utilizable because most people don't have rapid breakdown of that form of beta-hydroxybutyrate or ketone body, but it does linger for longer, and it has some effects on the heart. It also has some effects on the brain. And so as a result, if you wanted higher and more sustained levels, then that's something that you could consider. Now, but again, the sodium load's still a factor there. Now, you talked about natural forms of fat. Well, the most common one that most people appreciate is medium chain triglycerides. So C6, C8, C10. The one that most people see the most success with that we've actually tested in the lab that produces the highest ketone production and lowest GI issues, because that's one of the biggest side effects of medium chain triglycerides is that you have to slowly increase your use over time because it causes GI intolerance issues. Same thing with high carbohydrate intake though, but you have to be very careful because if you take too much at once, you'll be ready for a colonoscopy in no time. So be very careful about increasing over time and slowly so you don't basically evacuate everything in your colon. But those do naturally elevate ketone bodies in the blood. Actually, we know that MCTs are present in breast milk. It is what's reason that babies are in ketosis when they're first born.
Wow.
In fact, ketones are elevated in even in the fetus. We know that cord blood elevations of ketone bodies are in the multimillimolar level. So basically, but medium triglycerides are seen in butter, coconut, or you can just buy them over the market now at a much more concentrated level and utilize it for salad or other things. And they do reliably elevate ketone bodies in a natural form, and usually one of the cheapest forms of exogenous ketones that you can buy on the market. And they've been around and studied the longest since the 90s and 60s for malnutrition disorders in pediatric patients, and it worked. Now, the kicker with those is that they can't elevate ketone bodies usually that high by themselves because of the GI tolerance issue. And if you consume too much of it, it just is going to delay the absorption because it's a fat over time. So you're never going to get a very high peak elevation in ketone bodies, but you'll probably get a slow elevation over time. Now, that's the second one. The third one is actually all these molecules, like you mentioned about esters, that are all built on a backbone of 1,3-butadiene. So 1,3-butadiene is what's in products like Ketone IQ, where they actually have this molecule studied by by MIT for aerospace science. The idea that it was a very efficient, calorically dense fuel source that could be shelf stable for years. And we've seen that as well. But since then, we know that reliably is consumed, elevate ketone bodies in the blood. And then all these ketone esters are basically taking various other molecules like beta-hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, or some other molecule and binding it to the 1,3-butadiene through an ester bond to basically just add more molecules on top of the 1,3-butadiene. Now, why would you use this? Well, if you don't want the sodium load and you just want to elevate ketone bodies without the sodium load or without the GI issues, most people tolerate these pretty well. One barrier that most people describe is that you have to find a company that actually makes them taste decent, because one of the barriers is that they can taste pretty rough. But I think there's some companies that have done a good job with this over time in correcting for this. But this is where most of the research really looked at. Again, the most exogenous ketone that's been around for the longest is the MCT, just because it's a natural form that we know has been around for ages, since the 1950s and 60s in clinical trials. The next most common is the 1,3-butadiene, and the emergence of ketone salts and esters is really trying to evolve how we apply them when. There's also free acids. Now, free acids used to never be applicable in most settings because they would instantly, I'm going to butcher the term here. What was happening is that a free acid is unstable. So if you make a free acid in a chemical vat, so to speak, you can't stabilize it. And as a result, people were making them, but when they got to the point where they'd be commercially on the shelf, they would be basically no longer effective, because it would already, instantly have it would react to its environment, and then it would no longer be a ketone body anymore. And so basically you wouldn't be able to stabilize it. But there have been the ability to stabilize some of these molecules, and now they're on the market as well. But the only issue with that is that there's a high acid load. So it's kind of like consuming, you just got to be conscious of your tolerance for them. So the question here, Clay, is like, what do you use and when? And there's a whole bunch of different considerations of what and when, but you should usually look for ones that have been studied in scientific studies for what you want to use them for, right? So we talked about one of the studies that I was involved in using, which was HVMN, now Ketone IQ is the company name. They're kind of 1,3-butadiene based product that has a BHB attached to it, and that had been shown to improve cognition. We also know that molecules that have a 1,3-butadiene based backbone can increase EPO, and most of those products have increased oxygen levels in the muscle, and we've shown research in the brain as well. And so then you might want to apply it in a setting where you're considering altitude-based training or hypoxia considerations. Things like ketone salts versus ketone esters have a very different effect on acidosis levels in the blood. So ketone salts alkalize the blood, whereas exogenous ketones in ester form actually causes mild acidosis. And you think, oh, mild acidosis, that's bad. No, not necessarily. Mild acidosis is actually why we see increased oxygen uptake in the brain, and also probably the muscle as well, from our studies, which led to an improvement in cognition and hypoxia exposure. So it isn't inherently bad, right? It's about the net effect of what you want to happen. And they all seem to be applicable for various reasons. But like for myself, on a personal use perspective, I know I've used all these products, but the one that I typically lean towards is like these 1,3-butadiene based products, only because you can buy them. They're cost reasonable. That's another consideration, is like, are you going to take a $30 shot? Yeah. What type of shot are you getting? Yeah. It better make me freaking Elon Musk tomorrow, but so the way I think about it is like, what is it cost effective? What's going to get you your goals? And for me, the biggest consideration in my life currently with type 1 diabetes is to make sure that I am maintaining brain energy, preventing or recovering if hypoglycemia occurs, because I do jujitsu a lot, I exercise a lot. And so anytime you have rapid changes in insulin sensitivity, you always got to be cautious around that. And so I use them more as a strategy to prevent hypoglycemia or to protect against it. And also it's been shown to improve cognition coming out of low brain energy environments like hypoglycemia, more so than glucose alone.
Right.
So I know you're a physician, you've probably been taught, okay, if someone gets hypoglycemia, give them glucose or glucagon pen to elevate glucose. But in reality, there's evidence that shows that if you give ketone bodies with a glucose elevating material like glucose, or sorry, you give ketones alongside glucose, it actually restores brain function and cognition quicker.
Wow,
So
I did not know that.
That's what I typically use them for.
Can I ask you one rapid fire question? You don't have to go
for it.
Too deep into it or anything, obviously, because I hate that this is a rapid fire question, but in terms of cancer, I will tell the listeners this because, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the theory behind the ketogenic diet working so well in things like cancer is partially due to the Warburg effect. I believe I'm getting that correctly, which
that's correct.
Which is basically, in a nutshell, cancer cells primarily thrive off of glucose, where your other cells can adapt to things like ketones. And so going on a ketogenic diet, in theory, would quote unquote starve out cancer cells, or at least that's my dumbed down version of it. In terms of cancers, just because I have friends personally who are even my age that have cancer, are there certain types of cancer that a ketogenic diet would be more beneficial for, and certain types that you would try to avoid one?
Absolutely. So yes, there's this longstanding theory back in the 1920s where Otto Warburg discovered that many forms of cancer were highly glucose dependent through this mechanism called the Warburg effect. That led to a whole cascade of metabolic research in cancer called cancer metabolism, which is one of the most predominant thriving fields in all of science to date, which was basically started with Otto Warburg's work. Now, what we still know is that many forms of cancer are highly glucose dependent, believed to be resulting from altered mitochondrial function and more of a glucose reliance. But so think about this. You have a cancer cell, and in that cancer, or not you have a cancer cell, but you have a tumor. Okay. So when someone goes to the doctor's office and they find out they have cancer, it's because they have found typically a tumor of some sort. Now, there are blood cancers as well, but let's talk about solid tumors for a second. So they find a tumor, and maybe they felt their breast tissue, they felt a lump. They went to the doctors, they got checked. Oh, you have a lump in there. That's probably cancerous. Get checked, biopsy. Okay, confirmed cancer. Or they got a colonoscopy. They find out that they had some form of a lump in there. They do a biopsy, find out, okay, cancer. What happens next? Well, that tumor within the tumor itself, has thousands of cells. Every cell have the same metabolic and genetic and underlying properties? No, it doesn't. They're all diverse. But on the average, we see consistent metabolic effects with certain types of cancers, but not all. And this is really the field in of itself. It's an underlying complex scenario where you have very limited evidence as a standalone therapy in cancer in humans. As an adjunct, there's growing evidence, okay? But there's a lot more evidence in preclinical models or animal models, which is a totally different scenario, but the best evidence we often have for various cancers. And so many people can typically look, there's apps called Consensus and other apps, I don't know how well they are in this, but they're usually pretty good in other areas, where you can look up the weight of the evidence on specific types of tumors where they might be most applicable towards. And they're typically the ones that are more glucose dependent. This is why there's been such a focus on glioblastomas, or forms of brain cancer, very aggressive forms of brain cancer, because those are typically very highly glucose dependent. You actually assess that form of cancer by doing a glucose tracer assessment, and because they're so glucose dependent. So that makes a lot of logical sense. But the reason there's logic at all for the ketogenic diet is not only the Warburg effect, but also because the ketogenic diet isn't a standalone single mechanism. It is the reduction of glucose, the reduction of insulin. You could typically change a massive array of things within your metabolism, lower glucose dependence, increase fat oxidation, changing enzymes, changing the way many cells and tissues function. And those array of effects on top of the elevation of ketone bodies, which have antioxidant, anti-inflammatory properties in and of themselves, as well as changing genetics of cells through epigenetic regulation, all don't have isolated effects, and you combine them together, it may have a more powerful effect. And that is the fundamental logic behind the use and application of the ketogenic diet as a pleiotropic strategy, a potent strategy with multiple effects in one. But keep in mind, there has been a lot of hype in the ketogenic diet for cancer. And at this point, it has been preliminarily assessed in human studies. And the preliminary data looks promising, but we don't know, quote unquote, it's going to cure cancer. Okay, we don't know that at this point. We haven't had those studies to confirm that that is in fact the case, but there is a heck of a lot of work ongoing right now with millions and millions and millions of dollars to try to find that out, because the logic is clear and sound. So I can only tell you at this point, if I had cancer and I was a cancer type that would be benefited from it, I would 100% get on it, no question about it. But if it was one of the few cancers that maybe don't, I would probably do some advanced assessment to see what my risk ratio is with various assessment tests, and then consider whether it was worth the juice from the squeeze. So that's my thought.
I love it. Well, dude, Andrew, you are a wealth of knowledge. I am unbelievably grateful just to be able to pick your brain. I'm selfish that and spoiled that I get to ask my own questions, because I've listened to you on podcasts before, and I wrote down all these questions because whoever the podcaster was didn't ask the exact ones that I wanted. So I can't wait to go back and watch this and listen to it and learn from myself. And I am 100% going to do my own experiments on myself of going into a ketogenic diet. So I'll keep you updated on that. As far as people being able to follow you and get in touch with you and just stay updated on everything that you have going on, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
So I have a website, andrewkoutnik.com. If they want free resources or want to contact me, there's a contact page there. They can reach out to me. But I'm very active on Instagram and YouTube, and also Twitter or X as well. So if people want to find out new information, I post there quite frequently.
Yep. And I've seen it before too. So I've been soaking in all the knowledge myself on social media through you. So thank you again for coming on, and hopefully we can do this again sometime, because I'm sure I'll think of some more questions.
Cool, man. Honor to get to chat with you, Clay.
All right. See you later, bro.